Caleb Rourke came home to sign the demolition order, not to mourn. The cabin had belonged to his father, a man Caleb had spent years calling paranoid, stubborn, and impossible to save. But beneath the warped floorboards of that abandoned New Hampshire hideaway, behind a wall no contractor had noticed, something had been waiting in the dark. And before the day ended, Caleb would begin to wonder if the father he erased had been protecting him all along. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. But before the floor gave way, Caleb still believed the cabin was nothing but rot. The black SUV crawled up the washed-out road in low gear, its tires slipping over wet gravel and exposed roots. On either side, the New Hampshire woods pressed close, thick with spruce, birch, and pine. Caleb sat in the back seat with a leather folder across his knees, watching the road disappear under mud. He had not been to his father's cabin in years. Not since Arthur Rourke had stopped answering calls directly and started sending strange notes through third parties. Not since the warnings. Not since the accusations about land records, stolen signatures, and men in Boston rewriting history for profit. Caleb had built a billion-dollar company on clean lines, efficient housing systems, and redevelopment deals that turned failing properties into polished communities. His father had died in a sagging frame cabin with plywood over the windows and hand-painted signs warning trespassers to leave. To Caleb, the contrast had always felt like an answer. The SUV stopped at a rusted gate chained between two leaning posts. Beyond it, the old cabin sat half hidden in the trees. The roof dipped in the center. The porch had collapsed on one side. Dark moss covered the stone chimney, and two boarded windows stared back like closed eyes. Derek Sloan, Caleb's project manager, stepped out first. He was already checking his phone, though there was barely any signal. "Demolition crew can bring equipment in once we widen the access road," Derek said, assuming the caretaker unlocks the gate. The demolition contractor, Vic Hanley, stood beside him with a hard hat tucked under one arm. "Structure's not worth saving, I can tell you that from here." Caleb said nothing. He looked at the cabin and felt less grief than irritation. Even dead, Arthur had found a way to delay him. The land mattered now, not because of memory, because of timing. Caleb's company had planned a luxury retreat development across several connected parcels, and Arthur's cabin sat in the middle of the cleanest access route. The board wanted movement. Investors wanted certainty. Martin Vale, Caleb's mentor and closest redevelopment partner, had told him the same thing 3 days earlier. Clear it, document it, move forward. A small pickup truck rattled up behind them and stopped short of the gate. An older woman stepped out wearing a canvas jacket and mud-stained boots. Ruth Bell had managed small repairs and winter checks on the property during Arthur's final years. Caleb recognized her from a distance, but her face had hardened since he last saw her. "You brought a demolition crew," she said. "I brought an inspection crew," Caleb replied. Ruth looked past him at Vic's truck, where the side panel clearly read structural removal. "That what you call it now?" Caleb kept his voice controlled. "Ruth, I own the parcel. I need the gate opened." Her hand stayed in her jacket pocket, wrapped around the keys. "Your father didn't want this place flattened. My father didn't want a lot of reasonable things." Ruth's eyes flicked toward the cabin. "He asked about you every month." The words landed harder than Caleb expected, but he refused to show it. "That's not true." "It is. He had my number. He said calls could be blocked, said letters didn't always arrive." Caleb gave a tired, humorless breath. There it was again, the old spiral, the same suspicion that had swallowed Arthur's last years and turned every silence into a conspiracy. Caleb had offered help. He had offered doctors. He had offered to move Arthur somewhere safer. Arthur had refused all of it, then blamed everyone else for the distance he created. "I'm not doing this at the gate," Caleb said. For a moment, Ruth did not move, then she unlocked the chain. The cabin smelled of damp wood, mouse droppings, and old smoke. Caleb stepped inside and immediately saw the damage. Wallpaper hung in curled strips. The ceiling had water stains shaped like bruises. A cracked wood stove leaned near the far wall, and in the center of the main room stood the massive stone fireplace Arthur had always been proud of. It looked too large now. Vic moved through the room with a flashlight, tapping beams, checking floorboards, muttering under his breath. Derek took photos for the file. Caleb stood near the fireplace, trying not to remember Arthur's voice explaining how stone held heat through a winter night. "Something's odd," Vic said. Caleb turned. "What?" Vic pointed his flashlight toward the fireplace wall. "This central mass, it's eating up too much space. It's a chimney." "Not that much chimney." Vic pulled out a tape measure and walked the room. "Exterior length is about 40 feet. Interior usable space is barely 31, maybe 32 if I'm generous." Derek frowned. "Wall thickness? Doesn't explain it. You've got dead space somewhere behind or under this fireplace." Caleb felt annoyance rise again, but underneath it came something sharper. He knew buildings. He knew when measurements were wrong. His entire career had begun with floor plans, load paths, modular tolerances, mistakes other people missed. "Could be an old ash pit," Derek said, "or bad framing." Vic crouched near the fireplace and pressed a boot against a warped floorboard. It flexed strangely, not rotten exactly, but loose in a clean rectangular section. "That board's been lifted before," Vic said. Ruth, standing by the doorway, went very still. Caleb noticed. "What is it?" She shook her head. "Arthur told me never to touch anything near the hearth." Caleb stared at the floor, then at the fireplace, then back at Ruth. For the first time that morning, the cabin did not feel like a dead weight from his father's life. It felt arranged. "Pull it up," Caleb said. Vic wedged a pry bar beneath the board. The wood groaned, then came free with a crack that echoed through the empty cabin. Beneath it was not dirt, not subfloor, not a nest of ruined insulation. It was metal. An old rectangular access plate sat recessed between the joists, dark with age, bolted from below. Derek leaned closer. Why would it be bolted from underneath? Caleb did not answer. He crouched, brushed away dust with his sleeve, and saw deep scratches around the bolt heads. Fresh scratches. Someone had tried to open it recently. Caleb stayed crouched over the access plate, staring at the scratches around the bolt heads as if they might rearrange themselves into a harmless explanation. They did not. The marks were clean, pale against the darkened metal, too recent to belong to Arthur and too deliberate to belong to rot. Vic Hanley lowered himself beside him and ran one thick finger around the edge. "Somebody put a wrench to this. How recently?" Caleb asked. Vic shrugged. "Hard to say, but not 20 years ago. Not even 5, unless this place has been sealed better than it looks." Derek gave a nervous laugh from behind them. "Could be scavengers. Old cabins get hit all the time. Copper, tools, anything they can sell." Caleb looked around the room. The copper pipes had not been stripped. The old brass light fixtures still hung crookedly from the ceiling. Even the rusted stove parts were untouched. Whoever had come here had not been looking for scrap. Ruth stood near the doorway with both hands closed around the strap of her canvas bag. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor near the fireplace, and the longer she stared, the more Caleb felt the old irritation shift into something uneasy. "You knew about this?" he asked. "No," Ruth said, but she answered too fast. Caleb stood. "Ruth." She looked at him then, and the anger in her face had softened into something worse, fear. Not for herself. For Arthur, maybe, though Arthur was already gone, or for whatever he had left behind. "I knew he guarded that hearth," she said quietly. "That's all. He'd let me check the roof, the generator, the well pump, but never that spot. Never the pantry wall either." "The pantry wall?" Caleb turned toward the narrow opening beside the kitchen. Ruth pressed her lips together, realizing she had said more than she meant to. "He kept shelves there. Canned food, old tools. It looked ordinary." Caleb looked at Vic. "Can we open the plate?" Vic shook his head. "Not cleanly. It's bolted from underneath, like Derek said. That means access is from below, not above. If there's a crawl space or cellar, we find it first." "There's no basement listed on the property file," Derek said. Caleb almost answered, but the words caught in his throat. There had been no hidden plate listed either. He walked through the cabin slowly, forcing his mind back into the language he trusted. Structure, load, sequence, intent. The cabin was a simple A-frame, at least on paper. One main room, a small bedroom, a kitchen alcove, a bathroom that had been added later. But the fireplace sat too deeply into the center mass, swallowing space where there should have been framing or storage. He had made a fortune noticing inefficient space. He had built factories that produced modular homes by the inch, by the seam, by the tolerance. Bad measurements bothered him more than bad news. Bad measurements meant someone had lied or someone had hidden work. He stepped into the pantry area. The shelves were warped and dusty, but they were newer than the surrounding wall. The plywood behind them had a different grain and a different nail pattern. Not professional, not careless either. It had been meant to look boring, Vic, Caleb said. The contractor joined him with his flashlight. He studied the pantry wall, then tapped it twice with the back of his knuckles. The first sound was flat, the second was hollow. Derek stopped taking photos. Ruth whispered. Arthur said the house had places where the truth could breathe. Caleb turned to her. What does that mean? I don't know. I thought it was one of his sayings. Her voice thinned. I thought a lot of things were just sayings. Vic pulled a utility knife from his belt and cut along the edge of the plywood. Then he used the pry bar. The first sheet resisted, groaning as old nails backed out one by one. When it finally came loose, stale, cold air slid into the pantry. Behind the plywood was not insulation. It was a narrow wooden door, no knob, only a recessed iron pull blackened with age. Caleb stared at it. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Derek said, "That is definitely not on the drawings." Caleb reached for the iron pull, but Ruth caught his wrist. "Don't rush into something your father worked that hard to hide." The touch was light, but it stopped him. Caleb looked down at her hand, then at her face. Ruth had known Arthur in a way Caleb had refused to. She had seen him in the winters, in the years when the calls became shorter and the letters stranger. Caleb had seen only the inconvenience of an old man who would not cooperate. He pulled his wrist free but gently. If someone else has already tried to open this place, waiting won't protect anything. That ended the argument. The door stuck at first. Vic had to shoulder it once before it gave with a crack of swollen wood. Behind it, a steep set of narrow stairs descended into darkness. The smell that came up was damp clay, old stone, and something metallic Caleb could not place. Derek stepped back. "We should call someone." "We are someone," Vic muttered, though even he sounded less certain now. Caleb took the flashlight from him and aimed it down the stairs. The beam caught rough stone, then dirt, then the edge of a low cellar beneath the cabin. The space was cramped, unfinished, and colder than it should have been. Not a basement built for storage, more like a pocket carved out beneath the house. Caleb went first. Each step creaked under his weight. The air grew heavier as he descended. When his boots hit the dirt floor, the flashlight beam moved across old foundation stones, rotted support posts, and spiderwebs thick enough to look like gray cloth. Then the beam stopped. Directly beneath the fireplace, where open crawl space should have continued, stood a cinder block wall. It did not belong. The blocks were newer than the stone foundation. The mortar was rough, uneven, spread by hand rather than finished by a mason. It rose from the dirt floor to the underside of the joists, sealing off the entire center of the cabin. Caleb stepped closer and brushed his hand across the wall. Dust came away on his fingers, but not enough. The wall had been disturbed. Vic came down behind him and let out a low whistle. That was added later. "How much space behind it?" Caleb asked. "If your numbers upstairs are right?" Vic aimed his light along the wall, enough to hide a small room. Derek remained halfway up the stairs. "Caleb, this is officially beyond demolition inspection." Caleb ignored him. His pulse had started to beat hard in his ears. Ruth descended last, moving carefully, one hand on the wall. When she saw the cinder blocks, her face changed. She looked not surprised, exactly. She looked wounded. "What?" Caleb asked. She swallowed. "He told me once people had taken everything they could see. He said what mattered had to be put where greedy men hated looking." Caleb faced the wall again. The words should have sounded absurd. A week ago they would have. But upstairs was an access plate bolted from below. Behind a pantry wall was a hidden stair. Beneath the fireplace was a sealed space someone had recently tried to reach. Arthur had not imagined this. Caleb lifted the flashlight higher. Near the left edge of the cinder block wall, one block sat slightly out of line. Its mortar had cracked in a thin crescent around the corner. Vic noticed it too and stepped forward with the pry bar. "Careful," Caleb said. Vic worked the edge slowly. The block shifted with a gritty scrape. Cold air leaked through the opening, brushing Caleb's face. Not the stale dampness of the cellar. This was sharper, trapped, metallic. Something inside the wall rustled. Not an animal, not water. Paper. Caleb took the pry bar from Vic and pushed the loosened block farther inward. It dropped on the other side with a dull thud that echoed too deeply for a simple crawl space. Caleb crouched and aimed the flashlight through the gap. The beam cut across darkness, caught the edge of a wooden crate, then slid over a stack of sealed folders wrapped in plastic. And behind them, half swallowed by shadow, stood a steel door with faded lettering stamped across its surface. Caleb leaned closer until he could read the first words, Boston Safe and Vault Company. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The flashlight beam remained fixed on the steel door, while cold air drifted through the opening in the cinder block wall. Caleb felt the weight of every assumption he had carried about Arthur pressing against him. Paranoid men did not usually build hidden rooms beneath their cabins. Paranoid men did not install vault doors manufactured hundreds of miles away by specialized companies, or maybe they did. The problem was that Caleb no longer knew. Vic slowly exhaled. Well, that's not normal, Caleb said. Ruth stepped closer to the gap, the light reflected in her eyes as she stared at the steel door. He never told me about this. For some reason, Caleb believed her. The wall was carefully dismantled over the next hour. Nobody wanted to smash through it recklessly. Whatever sat behind it had survived for years. Caleb did not want the first thing he did to be destroying evidence he did not yet understand. As more blocks came free, the hidden space revealed itself. It was not large. Roughly 8 feet wide and 8 feet deep, the walls were reinforced with poured concrete. Metal shelves lined one side. Wooden crates sat stacked against the far corner, and at the center stood the steel door. It was smaller than a bank vault but larger than a household safe, thick, industrial, purpose-built. The faded lettering near the top remained barely visible. Boston Safe and Vault Company. Caleb stepped inside the room. Dust covered everything except the narrow path leading directly to the door. He froze. Vic, he said quietly. The contractor entered behind him. Look at the floor. The dust pattern told its own story. Most of the room had remained untouched for years, but a narrow trail of disturbed dust led from the entrance toward the vault door. Someone had walked there. Not recently enough to leave footprints, but recently enough to leave evidence. Vic crouched, maybe within the last year. Derek suddenly looked uncomfortable. Should we be calling law enforcement? For what? Caleb asked. A hidden vault, unknown contents, somebody breaking in. Caleb looked back at the steel door. The truth was he did not want anyone here yet, not because he intended to hide anything, because he had no idea what they had found, and because part of him feared that if outsiders took over now, he would lose the chance to understand why Arthur had built this place in the first place. The vault door was locked. A heavy rotary handle sat beneath a combination dial. Vic tested the handle carefully. Nothing moved. Solid, he said. No chance? Not without the combination. Caleb stepped closer. The metal surface showed scratches near the dial housing, not random scratches, tool marks. Someone had tried to open it, and failed. That realization sent a strange chill through him. Arthur had died almost 2 years earlier. Who was still looking for whatever was inside? Back upstairs, Derek argued for leaving immediately. This is becoming a liability nightmare, he said. We document everything. Call the county. Bring professionals. Caleb stood near the fireplace listening without really hearing. His attention had drifted toward an old desk shoved against the wall. It was one of the few pieces of furniture left inside the cabin. The drawers were warped shut. The wood had darkened with age. Something about it bothered him. He crossed the room and pulled the top drawer open. At first he saw nothing except old utility receipts and faded notebooks. Then he found a folded piece of paper. His name was written across the front. Caleb, the handwriting stopped him cold. Arthur's handwriting, not copied, not printed, not old enough to have faded away. Ruth noticed immediately. Is that from him? Caleb nodded. For a moment he considered opening it. Instead he folded it and slipped it carefully into his jacket pocket. Not yet, he wasn't ready. He hated that answer, but it was true. The rest of the afternoon disappeared into inventory. The crates inside the hidden room remained unopened. The vault remained locked. Caleb photographed everything, every wall, every shelf, every tool mark, every square foot of the space. He sent encrypted copies to a secure cloud server used by his company. Then he made a decision: no demolition. Derek stared at him. Excuse me? Projects paused. Caleb paused. Derek rubbed his forehead. The board won't like that. I didn't ask if they'd like it. The words came out harder than Caleb intended, but they were true. For the first time since arriving, He was no longer thinking about schedules. He was thinking about Arthur, about the old arguments, about the countless times Arthur had claimed people were changing records, moving property, hiding things. At the time, Caleb had assumed age and isolation had warped his father's judgment. Now there was a hidden room beneath the cabin, a vault, evidence someone else had searched for it, and a letter Arthur had left specifically for him. By sunset, the crew left for town. Only Caleb remained. Ruth stayed as well. She brewed coffee on a portable camping stove while darkness settled over the forest. The cabin felt different after nightfall, not haunted, watching, as if every board and nail had been waiting for someone to finally pay attention. Ruth handed him a mug. "You know," she said quietly, "Arthur wasn't always angry." Caleb looked into the coffee. "That's not the version I remember." "No." Her voice carried no accusation, which somehow made it worse. "He used to talk about you all the time." Caleb didn't answer. "He was proud of you." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Proud people don't spend 10 years telling everyone their son is destroying the state." Maybe. She looked toward the dark window. Or maybe hurt people don't always know how to speak without sounding angry. The words lingered, because Caleb suddenly realized something uncomfortable. He could remember every criticism Arthur had ever made, every accusation, every argument, but he struggled to remember the last honest conversation they had shared. Hours later, Ruth finally left. Caleb locked the cabin behind her. The silence returned. He sat alone at the old table with Arthur's unopened letter beside him. Outside, wind moved through the trees. Inside, the hidden room waited beneath the floor. Eventually, his phone buzzed. One bar of signal, a text message, Martin Vale. The timing immediately felt wrong. "Everything okay up there?" Caleb stared at the screen, then another message arrived. "Be careful around that property. Your father hid a lot more than old memories." Caleb's stomach tightened. He had told no one about the vault. Not Derek, not the board, not anyone outside the people physically present. Yet Martin somehow sounded like a man who already knew there was something worth finding. Caleb typed a simple response. "What exactly do you mean?" The reply came less than 10 seconds later. "Seal the place up and leave, Caleb, before you find something that can't be put back." Caleb read the message twice, then 3 times. The room suddenly felt colder. His eyes drifted toward the fireplace, toward the hidden room below, toward the vault door waiting in darkness, and for the first time he wondered whether Martin Vale had been afraid of Arthur all along. Caleb barely slept. The text messages from Martin remained open on his phone long after midnight. He read them again while sitting at Arthur's old table, the unopened letter still beside him. Outside, the forest shifted in the wind. Inside, every creak of the cabin felt different now, not threatening, intentional. By dawn, he had made 2 decisions. First, nobody outside a small circle would learn about the vault until he understood what was inside. Second, he was opening it legally. The moment the sun cleared the trees, Caleb began making calls. The first went to a licensed safe technician in Concord who specialized in historical vault systems. The second went to his personal attorney in Boston. The third went to a secure record storage company his firm occasionally used during litigation. If the vault contained nothing important, he would lose a few days. If it contained evidence, he would need a documented chain of custody from the beginning. By noon, Derek had arrived looking exhausted and annoyed. "You've officially delayed 3 separate project timelines." Caleb continued photographing the hidden room. "I know. The board isn't going to love this. They don't have to." Derek stared at him. That answer would have been impossible a week earlier. Normally, Caleb calculated every decision through invest, deadlines, and public perception. Now something else was driving him, not curiosity. Responsibility. The realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The safe technician arrived shortly after lunch. His name was Leonard Cross, a gray-haired specialist who had spent decades restoring historical security systems for museums and banks. He spent nearly 20 minutes examining the vault door before speaking. "This is older than I expected. You can open it?" Caleb asked. Maybe that was not reassuring. Leonard pointed toward the dial assembly. Someone tried to force this. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his stomach. How recently? Not recently enough to leave clean marks, but definitely after installation. He ran a flashlight over the metal. The locking mechanism wasn't breached, Whoever tried gave up. Ruth stood quietly nearby. Arthur never mentioned a vault? Leonard asked. No, then he wanted it forgotten. Caleb looked toward the door. Or protected. The process took the rest of the afternoon. Leonard refused shortcuts. Everything was documented. Photos, video, witness signatures, inventory forms. The further they went, the more real the situation became. This was no longer a strange discovery beneath an abandoned cabin. It was a sealed archive someone had worked very hard to hide, and someone else had worked very hard to find. Near sunset, the final locking mechanism released. The sound was soft, almost disappointing. A simple metallic click, but everyone heard it. Nobody moved immediately. Leonard stepped back. Well, he said quietly. It's open. Caleb approached the wheel. His hands felt unexpectedly heavy. For years he had believed Arthur spent his final days trapped inside delusions. Every strange claim, every accusation, every warning about developers and land records, Caleb had dismissed them all. Now a hidden vault sat open beneath the cabin. The possibility that Arthur had been telling the truth felt harder to face than the possibility he had been wrong. The steel door groaned outward. Cold, stale air drifted into the room. Leonard swept his flashlight inside first, then stopped. Interesting. Caleb stepped beside him. The vault was larger than he expected. Shelves lined both walls. Metal filing boxes sat stacked in careful rows. Several waterproof storage cases rested beneath them. Bundles of old documents filled plastic sleeves. There was money too, not much. Several wrapped packets of old bills, nothing remotely close to a fortune. Nothing that explained the elaborate security. The real treasure was paper, thousands of pages, records, maps, ledgers, files, evidence. Ruth quietly covered her mouth. Oh, Arthur. Caleb stepped farther inside. Every shelf carried handwritten labels, parcel surveys, transfer records, correspondence, trust filings, corporate registrations. One section caught his eye immediately. Vehicle Holdings. His pulse quickened. Martin's last name. The name appeared again and again. Several boxes carried identical labels. Vale Holdings, Transfersval Holdings, Profit Chainval Holdings, Corridor Project. Caleb stared at them. That wasn't coincidence, not anymore. Leonard remained near the entrance. Looks like your father was collecting records. No, Caleb said quietly. This is more than collecting. The organization was meticulous. Cross-referenced, indexed. Dated. Arthur had not thrown random documents into storage. He had built a system. The realization landed with uncomfortable force. This was work, years of work, years Caleb had written off as paranoia. Hours passed. They inventoried everything, photographed everything, catalogued everything. The process was slow but necessary. Night had fully settled outside when Caleb finally noticed something resting alone on the far shelf. Unlike the boxes, it was not labeled. Unlike the other documents, it sat by itself. A single envelope. His name was written across the front. Caleb Rourke handwriting was unmistakable. Arthur's. The sight hit harder this time, because now Caleb knew Arthur had written it after building all of this, after gathering evidence, after deciding what mattered enough to hide. He picked up the envelope carefully. The paper felt fragile, old, personal. For several seconds he simply stared at it. Then he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, only 2 pages. The first line immediately stole the air from his lungs. If you're reading this, then either I finally found the courage to show you the truth, or someone forced you to find it without me. Caleb sat down on an old storage crate. The room disappeared around him. Arthur's words were direct, clear. Nothing like the rambling notes Caleb remembered receiving years ago. Arthur wrote that he never expected Caleb to believe him. He wrote that powerful people were rewriting ownership records tied to older property networks. He wrote that every time he tried to send evidence, it vanished. And then came the sentence Caleb read 3 times. Martin Vale is not protecting you from me. He is protecting himself from what I found. Caleb lowered the letter. The room felt suddenly smaller. Ruth noticed immediately. What is it? He didn't answer right away, because saying the words out loud would make them real. Finally, he handed her the page. She read it silently, then sat down beside him. Neither spoke. The accusation alone proved nothing. Arthur had believed many things. Evidence mattered, facts mattered, but one question refused to leave Caleb's mind. Why Martin? Martin had helped build his company, introduced investors, opened doors, supported him during years when Arthur barely returned calls. If Arthur was right, then nearly every success Caleb credited to Martin suddenly needed re-examination, and that possibility terrified him. Leonard finally cleared his throat. There's something else. Everyone looked up. The technician stood beside one of the lower shelves. He had discovered a leather-bound ledger tucked behind several filing boxes. Unlike everything else, it was newer. Not decades old, recent. The last entries appeared only a few years before Arthur's death. Caleb walked over. The ledger fell open near the middle. Rows of handwritten notes filled the pages. Property names, corporate entities, dates, transfer references. Most meant nothing. Until Caleb reached one entry and froze. His own company's redevelopment project appeared in the margin. The exact project currently scheduled to absorb Arthur's land. Below it sat a handwritten note from Arthur. Martin thinks the original chain is gone. He doesn't know I traced it back to him. And beneath that sentence was a photocopied signature. Martin Vale's signature, attached to a land transfer Caleb himself had personally approved. Caleb did not speak for nearly a minute. The ledger remained open in front of him. Arthur's handwriting filled the margins. Dates, notes, references, questions. It looked less like the work of a paranoid old man and more like the notebook of someone building a case. Ruth sat quietly across from him. Leonard had already begun securing the inventory process, photographing every page of anything left the vault. Nobody rushed. That alone made the moment feel heavier. Because if Arthur had spent years collecting this evidence, Caleb owed him at least a few hours of patience. Finally, Caleb picked up the photocopied transfer document. The signature looked authentic. Too authentic. That was what frightened him. He remembered signing approval packages connected to dozens of acquisitions. Martin had always handled preliminary reviews. Caleb had focused on financing, construction timelines, and investor relations. He had trusted the system because he trusted Martin. Now he wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. Make copies of everything, Caleb said. Leonard nodded. Already planned. No one touches the originals. Understood. Caleb turned toward Ruth. I need secure storage. You think someone will come looking? He looked around the hidden room. They already did. The damaged bolts outside suddenly carried more weight than before. Someone had searched this cabin. Someone had known enough to try. The question was whether they had found what they needed, or whether they were still looking. The answer came sooner than expected. At nearly 10 o'clock that night, Caleb's phone vibrated. Martin. For a second, Caleb simply stared at the screen. Then he answered. Long day? Martin asked. His voice sounded relaxed. Too relaxed, something like that. I heard demolition hasn't started. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Only a handful of people knew the schedule. It got delayed. That's unfortunate. The pause that followed felt deliberate. Martin continued. You know, Arthur always had a talent for creating distractions. Caleb remained silent. I'd hate to see you waste time chasing ghosts. There it was. Not a direct warning, not an accusation, something subtler. Martin was testing him, trying to learn how much he knew. Caleb refused to take the bait. I'll call you when I get back to Boston. Do that. The line disconnected. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet Caleb felt more uneasy afterward than before. Martin had called too quickly, and he had sounded too interested. The next morning, Caleb drove into town. He needed answers from someone who knew Arthur before the isolation swallowed him. Ruth pointed him toward a surveyor named Nora Pike. According to Ruth, Nora had spent years helping local landowners fight boundary disputes and development pressure. More importantly, she had trusted Arthur when most people stopped listening. Nora's office occupied the second floor of an aging brick building overlooking the town center. Maps covered nearly every wall, property lines, forest easements, conservation parcels, decades of land history layered across New Hampshire. She studied Caleb for several seconds after he introduced himself. You finally came. The words landed harder than he expected. What does that mean? It means Arthur talked about you. Caleb looked away. Nora noticed. He wasn't angry as often as people think. That hurt more than if she had accused him, because anger would have been easier. She motioned toward a large table. Show me what you found. Caleb hesitated, then opened copies of several vault documents. Nora reviewed them carefully. At first she said nothing, then she pulled one survey map closer. A crease formed between her eyebrows. That's impossible. What is? She pointed toward the cabin layout. The measurements. Caleb felt a pulse of recognition. The hidden room? No. She grabbed another map, then a third. Within minutes she had spread multiple documents across the table. The room explains part of it. Part of what? Nora tapped the center of the cabin drawing. The fireplace. Caleb frowned. What about it? It doesn't fit. He remembered the contractor mentioning that before demolition. At the time it seemed insignificant, now it didn't. Nora slid a ruler across the plans. The fireplace is too wide. By how much? Almost 8 feet. Caleb stared at the numbers. That doesn't make sense. Exactly. The cabin dimensions didn't match the usable interior space. Even after accounting for the hidden vault, something remained missing. Nora sat back slowly. There should be another chamber. Silence settled over the office. Caleb looked at the maps again. Then again, the numbers refused to change. 8 feet, 8 missing feet, not empty space, unexplained space. His stomach tightened. Arthur never mentioned it? Nora shook her head. Not to me. The discovery should have felt exciting. Instead it felt dangerous, because Arthur had documented everything. If another hidden area existed, there was a reason. And if Arthur had hidden one vault already, what had been important enough to hide twice? The question followed Caleb all afternoon. By sunset he returned to the cabin with Nora and Ruth. The forest felt different now, not peaceful, watchful. The three of them worked through Arthur's plans, measuring walls, foundations, and support beams. Every calculation led back to the same conclusion. 8 feet remained unaccounted for. Finally Nora stopped near the massive stone fireplace. She ran her hand along the rockwork, then frowned. These stones are older. Caleb stepped closer. Older than what? The cabin. He blinked. What? The construction styles don't match. She pointed toward the joints. The fireplace existed first. Caleb stared. A cold sensation moved through him. The cabin had always been presented as Arthur's retreat, a place built after years of family conflict, a place where he withdrew from the world. But if the fireplace predated the cabin itself, then something else had existed here before Arthur ever arrived. Something hidden, something worth building around. Nora tapped one particular stone. A hollow sound echoed from behind it. Everyone froze. Ruth looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at the fireplace. Slowly, carefully, Nora knelt down. Near the base of the stonework, hidden behind decades of soot and dust, she uncovered a narrow metal edge, not a structural support, not decoration, a concealed seam, the outline of another access panel. Much older than the vault door, and unlike the vault, this one appeared to have been sealed from the inside. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The narrow metal seam sat hidden beneath layers of soot and age, as if the fireplace had spent decades protecting it. Caleb crouched beside Nora and brushed away more dirt with his fingertips. The edge became clearer. It wasn't part of the original stonework. Someone had concealed it deliberately. "Can you open it?" Ruth asked quietly. Nora shook her head. "Not from here." She pointed toward a rusted locking mechanism barely visible behind the stone lip. It's secured from the other side. Caleb stared at the panel, sealed from inside. The detail unsettled him more than the hidden vault had. People locked things to keep others out. But sealing something from within suggested something different. Someone had wanted whatever was inside to stay hidden even after they were gone, or they had feared someone would eventually come looking. Darkness settled over the forest outside. They moved portable lights into the cabin and continued examining the fireplace. By midnight, Nora discovered another clue. A faint draft, cold air slipped through cracks near the base stones. The hidden compartment connected somewhere beyond the cabin foundation, which meant the structure beneath the fireplace was larger than anyone had realized. Caleb felt the mystery shifting again. The vault had exposed documents. This felt older, more personal, maybe even more dangerous. The next morning he called Leonard. Within hours the attorney arrived with a structural engineer. No demolition crews, no contractors. Only people capable of documenting everything properly. Caleb refused to make another mistake. The engineer spent nearly 2 hours inspecting the foundation. When he finally emerged from beneath the crawl space, his expression had changed. "There is definitely another chamber." Ruth folded her arms. "How big?" "Hard to say." He checked his notes. "Maybe 6 by 10 feet. Caleb looked toward the fireplace. "And no obvious entrance?" "Not anymore." The engineer hesitated. Whatever access existed was intentionally removed. That answer only created more questions. Arthur had preserved one vault. Who had hidden the second chamber? And why hadn't Arthur mentioned it in any of the documents they had already found? Late that afternoon, Caleb returned to the steel room below the cabin. He began reviewing Arthur's records again. This time he focused on dates rather than transactions. Patterns slowly emerged. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Survey markers, property parcels, legal notices, certified mail receipts. The same handful of addresses surfaced over and over. One address stopped him cold. A small office building in Boston, not owned by Martin, not owned by Caleb's company, owned by a trust. The trust's name appeared nowhere else in current business records. Yet Arthur had circled it 3 separate times. Beside the final entry he had written a single sentence. If this trust survives, the truth survives. Caleb copied the address, then called Leonard. Within an hour the attorney's research team began pulling public records. The results arrived just before sunset. The trust still existed. Barely, inactive, dormant, forgotten, but legally alive. And one of its original trustees had been Evelyn Marks, the retired title examiner, the same woman who had preserved duplicate files. The realization made Caleb sit upright. Arthur hadn't scattered evidence randomly. He had built backups, layers of protection. One failed safeguard led to another. One trusted person led to the next. Like a man preparing for the possibility that nobody would believe him, including his own son. The thought hurt, because it sounded exactly like something Arthur would have needed to do. Near midnight, Cal finally forced himself to continue reading the letter addressed to him. Until now he had only managed small sections. The guilt made the rest difficult. Tonight he read further. Arthur's handwriting grew shakier in the later pages, yet the message remained clear. Martin is not afraid of what I know. He is afraid of what you might eventually learn. Caleb stopped. His chest tightened. Further down on the page, Arthur described several attempts to reach him. Packages, letters, documents, all sent through channels Arthur believed were safe. None received responses. At first Arthur assumed Caleb was ignoring him. Later he realized something else. Someone was intercepting the communication. Caleb read that paragraph 3 times, then a 4th. The pain wasn't simply that Arthur had tried, it was that Arthur eventually understood. His father had known Caleb never received those messages, which meant Arthur had died believing reconciliation was still possible, and Caleb had spent years believing the opposite. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the silence heavier. He closed the letter and stared at the wall. For the first time since arriving, he allowed himself to imagine Arthur sitting alone in this place, writing, waiting, hoping. Not angry, not broken, just increasingly isolated. The image stayed with him long after midnight. The following morning brought another shock. Nora arrived carrying a weathered cardboard tube. I found something. Caleb looked up from the dining table. What is it? A survey overlay Arthur gave me years ago. She carefully unrolled the contents. Several aged maps spread across the table. Property lines crisscrossed the page. Conservation boundaries. Road easements, ownership transfers. Then she pointed toward a narrow section near the cabin parcel. This shouldn't exist. Caleb leaned closer. A thin strip of land connected Arthur's property to 3 redevelopment parcels currently being acquired through Martin's investment network. The connection wasn't obvious. It had been buried beneath decades of transfers. But it existed. And if the underlying records were fraudulent, multiple modern acquisitions could become vulnerable. The room went quiet. Ruth understood the implication first. This isn't about one cabin. No, Nora said softly, it never was. For several minutes nobody spoke, then Caleb's phone vibrated. Unknown number, he almost ignored it, almost. Instead he answered, Caleb Rourke. Silence greeted him. Then a voice, older, male, nervous. I heard you're asking questions about Arthur. Caleb exchanged a glance with Nora. Who is this? The man hesitated. My name doesn't matter right now. It matters to me. Another pause, then a heavy sigh. I worked for Martin years ago. Every muscle in Caleb's body tightened. The caller continued. I signed papers I shouldn't have signed. What papers? No, not over the phone. Fear colored every word. Real fear, not performance, not manipulation. The fear of someone carrying a secret too long. Then meet me, Caleb said. Silence again, longer this time. Finally the man answered. I can prove Arthur wasn't lying. Caleb stood, his pulse hammered. What proof? The caller's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. I have the missing box, and before Caleb could say another word, the line went dead. Caleb stared at the dark phone screen long after the call ended. Nobody in the room spoke. Nora was the first to break the silence. You believe him? I don't know. But he did know one thing. The caller knew about the missing box. That detail had never become public. Only a handful of people even knew it existed, which meant the man either had the box or had been close to whoever stole it. Neither possibility was comforting. Leonard arrived the next morning after Caleb briefed him on the call. The attorney listened carefully before setting a folder on the kitchen table. You don't go alone. I wasn't planning to. Good. Leonard leaned forward, because if Martin is involved, this isn't about old paperwork anymore. It's about evidence preservation. The words landed heavily. Evidence, not family memories, not misunderstandings, evidence. That distinction made the situation feel more dangerous than ever. The caller contacted Caleb again shortly after noon. This time the instructions were simple. An abandoned maintenance depot outside Berlin, New Hampshire. 5 o'clock, no police, no company security. Come with one person, nothing more. The line disconnected. Leonard immediately objected. So did Nora, so did Ruth, but Caleb already knew he was going. Arthur had spent years chasing fragments of the truth. The least Caleb could do was follow one lead. At 5 minutes before 5, Caleb and Leonard parked outside the abandoned depot. The building sat beside a disused rail line. Broken windows, faded brick, weeds growing through cracked pavement. The place felt forgotten, which was probably why it had been chosen. They waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, a pickup truck appeared from the opposite direction. An older man stepped out, late 60s, thin, nervous. His eyes moved constantly, checking the road, checking the depot, checking the sky. Like someone who'd spent years expecting trouble. You Caleb? Yes. The man nodded. My name's Walter Green. He looked toward Leonard. Lawyer? Yes. Walter exhaled. Oddly, he seemed relieved. Then he reached into the truck and removed a weathered metal case. Caleb recognized it immediately. It matched the inventory descriptions from Arthur's vault. The missing box. His pulse accelerated. Walter set it carefully on the hood of the truck. I didn't steal it. Nobody spoke. Walter swallowed. I took it after Arthur died. That wasn't the answer Caleb expected. Why? Walter looked away. Because Arthur asked me to. The world seemed to stop for a second. What? Walter rubbed his face. We worked together years ago. Survey jobs, boundary disputes, small-town land fights nobody cared about. His voice softened. Arthur knew somebody would eventually come looking. Martin? Walter nodded. He never said the name. But he knew. Caleb exchanged a glance with Leonard. Then why keep the box? Because Arthur gave me instructions. Walter tapped the metal case. He said if nobody came for it, destroy it. And if somebody did. Walter looked directly at Caleb. He said only give it to his son. The words hit harder than Caleb expected. Only give it to his son. Not a lawyer, not a judge, not a reporter. His son. The son Arthur believed might eventually come. Even after everything, Walter unlocked the case. Inside were documents, several folders. A flash drive, a small notebook, and an envelope. The envelope carried Caleb's name. Different handwriting from the first letter. Newer, Shakir, written closer to the end. Caleb stared at it but didn't open it. Not yet. Leonard began examining the contents. His expression darkened almost immediately. What is it? The attorney looked up. Corporate formation records. Walter nodded. Arthur spent years tracking those. Leonard flipped through more pages. Shell companies, property transfers, trust agreements, layer after layer, far more complete than anything from the vault. This wasn't just evidence. It was a roadmap. A blueprint showing how ownership moved from entity to entity before eventually reaching Martin's development network. Walter pointed toward one folder. That's the important one. Leonard opened it. Silence followed. Then another page, then another. Finally he looked at Caleb. These are original releases. Caleb's stomach tightened. The missing ones? Yes. The documents Nora had mentioned. The releases Arthur believed were fraudulent. The papers Martin apparently wanted removed. For the first time they had originals. Not copies, not notes, not references. Actual documents. The significance was enormous and terrifying. Because now there was proof someone had gone to considerable effort to make them disappear. Walter suddenly looked even more uneasy. There's something else. Everyone turned toward him. He hesitated. For a moment Caleb thought he might change his mind. Then Walter spoke. Martin didn't act alone. The air seemed to leave the room. What do you mean? Walter's hands trembled slightly. I signed some of the witness certifications. Caleb felt anger surge through him. Walter raised both hands immediately. I didn't know. Didn't know what? That they were false. His voice cracked. I thought they were routine transfers. Years of guilt sat behind those words. Years. I figured it out later. Why didn't you come forward? Walter laughed bitterly. Because by then Martin owned half the people I would have reported it to. Nobody answered. The sadness in the statement felt genuine. Not like an excuse, more like regret. The kind that hardens over decades. Walter pointed toward another file. Arthur collected everything he could find. Leonard opened it. Banking summaries, transfer records, trust documents, correspondence. Enough material to justify a serious forensic review. But not enough to win outright, not yet. Caleb understood immediately. The evidence answered old questions, but opened larger ones. Who else knew? Who else helped? How many current properties depended on those transfers remaining hidden? The sun had nearly disappeared when they finished. Walter looked exhausted, relieved, like a man setting down a burden he had carried too long. Before leaving, he handed Caleb the second envelope. He told me this one was different. Caleb looked at the faded paper. Different how? Walter hesitated, then answered quietly. He said not to open it until you learned who benefited most from losing him. Words lingered after Walter drove away. Hours later, back at the cabin, Caleb sat alone at the kitchen table. The unopened envelope rested beside Arthur's earlier letters. Outside, darkness filled the woods. Inside, the cabin felt strangely alive. Like every secret buried within its walls was slowly finding its way to the surface. Leonard was reviewing the recovered documents in another room. Nora and Ruth had finally gone home. For the first time all day, Caleb was alone. His phone buzzed, a new email from the redevelopment board. Subject line, Emergency Governance Review. His access privileges had been suspended pending investigation. Caleb read the message twice, then a third time. Martin had moved faster than expected. The battle was no longer hidden. It had reached his company, his reputation, his future. A second notification appeared moments later, an internal memo, attached by someone anonymously. Caleb opened it. His blood ran cold. The document contained a list of redevelopment parcels currently under acquisition. Several had been highlighted. Beside each highlighted property was the same handwritten note. Arthur was right, and at the bottom of the page beneath every parcel number appeared one final line. Next closing scheduled in 10 days. Caleb barely slept. The anonymous memo remained open on his laptop long after midnight. Every highlighted parcel connected back to acquisition chains he had approved over the years. Some had generated millions in profit. Others were still in development. For the first time, he stopped asking whether Martin had deceived him. The question had changed. How much of his success had been built on things he never wanted to see? By sunrise, Leonard was already reviewing the recovered documents from Walter Green's box. The attorney looked worse than he had the night before. That alone worried Caleb. You found something. Leonard removed his glasses. I found enough to make Martin nervous. That's not the same thing as proving fraud, no. Leonard tapped several pages, but it's enough to justify emergency review. Caleb sat down across from him. The folders contained original releases, witness certifications, property transfer agreements, and internal correspondence dating back nearly 20 years. Several signatures matched, others didn't. Some documents appeared genuine until examined beside Arthur's handwritten comparison notes. Then inconsistencies began appearing everywhere. Dates, witnesses, property descriptions, tiny details. The kind most people ignored, the kind Arthur had spent years documenting. Caleb felt sick. His father hadn't been obsessing over fantasies. He had been conducting an investigation, alone, for years, and nobody had listened, not even his own son. By mid-morning, Nora arrived carrying survey maps spread across a cardboard tube. She immediately claimed a corner of the kitchen table. Look at this. She flattened several aging plats beside Arthur's notes. Leonard joined them. Within minutes, a pattern emerged. Several disputed parcels formed a corridor connecting old industrial properties in Boston with redevelopment zones stretching north toward New Hampshire. At first glance, the parcels appeared unrelated. Different owners, different projects, different companies, but Arthur had drawn lines between them, handwritten arrows, Dates, entity names, shell companies, the same names appearing again and again. Caleb recognized one immediately. Vale Urban Holdings, a company Martin had repeatedly described as insignificant. The maps suggested otherwise. This wasn't random, Nora said quietly. No. Keb stared at the chain of properties. It was planned. The realization settled heavily across the room. Arthur hadn't discovered isolated wrongdoing. He had uncovered a system, a machine, and Martin appeared to sit near the center of it. The phone rang shortly after noon. It was one of Caleb's board members, Thomas Avery, normally calm. Today he sounded exhausted. Where are you? New Hampshire. A long silence followed. Then stay there. Caleb frowned. What happened? You've been suspended from active oversight. Even though Caleb already knew, hearing the words directly still hurt. Thomas continued. Martin pushed through an emergency governance review this morning. Without me. You weren't invited. The bitterness in Thomas's voice revealed more than his words. Not everyone supported Martin. That mattered. What are they saying? They claim you're acting irrationally because of your father's estate. Caleb laughed once. No humor, just disbelief. That actually worked? For some people. Thomas lowered his voice. Martin's telling investors you've become emotionally compromised. The phrase landed like a punch. Emotionally compromised. As if caring about the truth automatically made someone unstable. As if Arthur's reputation could be dismissed the same way, the same tactic, the same language, years apart, different targets, same strategy, discredit first, control the narrative second. Caleb thanked Thomas and ended the call. For several seconds he said nothing, then he picked up Arthur's unopened envelope, the second one, the one Walter had protected for years. The one Arthur had instructed him to deliver only after Caleb learned who benefited most from losing him. No one stopped him. Slowly he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Only 3 pages. Written near the end of Arthur's life. Caleb recognized the uneven handwriting immediately. His chest tightened. He began reading. Arthur did not write about property disputes. He did not write about shell companies. He wrote about regret, about pride, about silence. He admitted mistakes. Admitted anger, admitted saying things he wished he could take back. Then the tone changed. Arthur wrote that Martin never needed Caleb to hate him completely. He only needed distance. A little distance each year, a few missed calls, a few intercepted letters, a few conversations redirected. Enough time would do the rest. The sentence that followed nearly broke him. If you are reading this, son, it means someone finally failed to keep us apart. Caleb closed his eyes. For years he had imagined Arthur choosing isolation, choosing bitterness, choosing stubbornness over family. Now every assumption felt poisoned, not because Arthur was perfect, but because Arthur had never stopped trying. The realization hurt more than any evidence file. Late that afternoon, Leonard received a call from the forensic accountant he had hired 2 days earlier. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, the attorney looked stunned. What now? Leonard slid a printed report across the table. The shell companies. Caleb read quickly, then slowed, then read again. Funds originating from several disputed property transfers eventually flowed into investment vehicles tied to Martin's redevelopment fund. The trail wasn't complete, not yet, but enough links existed to establish a pattern. Enough to justify deeper investigation. Enough to create panic. This is real. Leonard nodded, very real. For the first time, Caleb saw genuine concern in the attorney's face, not curiosity, not professional caution. Concern because the numbers were becoming too large, too interconnected, too dangerous. A few hours later, Ruth arrived unexpectedly. She looked pale, shaken. Something was wrong. I saw someone. Everyone turned toward her. At the cabin? She nodded. Near the ridge trail. Caleb stood immediately. When? An hour ago. Ruth wrapped her arms around herself. He wasn't hiking. How do you know? Because he was taking photographs. The room went silent. What kind of photographs? The cabin. Her answer came instantly. The access road, the gate, the windows, everything. Nora exchanged a glance with Caleb. Nobody needed to explain what it meant. Someone was watching again. Leonard immediately contacted local authorities and requested documentation of the report. Nothing dramatic, no accusations, just a record, a paper trail. Exactly what Arthur had spent years trying to create. As darkness settled across the woods, Caleb walked outside alone. The cabin stood quietly beneath the trees. No lights except the ones glowing from the windows, no movement, no sounds, just wind moving through pine branches. He looked toward the ridge Ruth mentioned, nothing, yet he couldn't shake the feeling. The story was accelerating. The closer they came to the truth, the less hidden their investigation became. Somewhere beyond the trees, someone knew that too. His phone vibrated. A text message. Unknown number, no greeting, no explanation, only an image. Caleb opened it. The photograph showed a conference room, a boardroom table, several familiar faces, Martin among them. The picture appeared recent, maybe taken that very day. At the center of the table sat a single folder. Its cover page was clearly visible, even from the photograph. The title froze Caleb where he stood. Arthur Rourke, Estate Confidential Settlement Optional. The title, handwritten in red ink. Someone had added 4 words. He knows you're close. Caleb stared at the photograph for a long time. The message beneath it bothered him more than the image itself. He knows you're close. Not they, not we, just he. Someone inside Martin's circle had sent it. Someone willing to take a risk. The question was why. He forwarded the image immediately to Leonard, then called him. The attorney answered on the first ring. Tell me you've seen this. I have. A pause followed. And if it's authentic, Martin is preparing something. Caleb looked back toward the cabin. The lights glowed warmly against the darkness, but the feeling of safety was gone. He already is. The next morning began with bad news. An emergency meeting of the redevelopment board had been scheduled for 48 hours later. Martin was moving faster, much faster. Thomas Every called again before 8. This isn't a normal review. What is it? A containment strategy. Caleb leaned back in his chair. Meaning? Martin wants a vote before more evidence surfaces. The answer confirmed what Caleb already suspected. The board wasn't being asked to discover the truth. It was being asked to choose which version of the truth would survive. By noon, Leonard had arranged a meeting with the forensic accountant. Her name was Dana Pierce. She arrived carrying 3 binders and a laptop. The exhaustion on her face matched everyone else's. She sat down and immediately opened spreadsheets. Before we continue, understand something. Caleb nodded. Dana pointed toward a cluster of transactions. What I found doesn't prove criminal intent. Understood. But it proves concealment. That word landed heavily. Concealment. She explained how money moved through multiple limited liability companies before reaching investment funds connected to Martin's redevelopment network. Each individual transfer looked ordinary. Together they formed something else. A pattern. One Arthur had spent years trying to document. Dana enlarged several transaction chains. The same names appeared repeatedly. The same attorneys, the same addresses, the same registration agents. Too many coincidences. Far too many. Then she showed Caleb something that made his stomach tighten. One entity involved in the disputed transfers was currently participating in the planned sale of Arthur's land. The very sale scheduled to close in days. The same sale Caleb no longer controlled. The same sale Arthur had spent years trying to prevent. For several seconds nobody spoke. Finally Leonard broke the silence. Can we establish direct benefit? Dana nodded slowly, not completely. Then she pointed at a highlighted section. But we can establish enough connection to justify an injunction request. That was all Caleb needed. Not certainty, a legal basis, a chance. The rest would come later. By late afternoon Caleb made a decision. Instead of waiting for Martin's next move, he filed a formal internal conflict notice through company counsel. The document stated that evidence had surfaced connecting current redevelopment activities to disputed historical property transfers. It required preservation of records, no deletions, no destruction, no modifications. Every relevant file became subject to review. Martin would receive notice within hours. Thomas called almost immediately. You actually filed it? Yes. You know what this means. Caleb did. The notice protected evidence. It also declared war. For the first time he wasn't reacting, he was acting, and Martin would understand exactly what that meant. That evening, Ruth asked him to walk with her. They followed a narrow trail behind the cabin as the sun disappeared beyond the trees. For several minutes neither spoke. Then Ruth stopped near an old stone marker. Arthur used to come here. Caleb looked at the weathered rock. No plaque, no inscription, nothing remarkable. Why? He said it helped him think. She smiled sadly. He'd sit for hours. Caleb swallowed. Did he talk about me? Ruth didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, every time. The words hurt more than he expected. He was angry, I know. He was stubborn, I know. Ruth looked directly at him, but he never stopped being your father. The forest suddenly felt very quiet. Caleb stared into the fading light. For years he had protected himself with certainty. Arthur chose this. Arthur pushed everyone away. Arthur stopped trying. Those beliefs had made life easier, cleaner. Now each one was collapsing, and underneath them sat something much harder. Regret. Late that night, Nora arrived carrying another box recovered from Arthur's records. Most contained survey notes, boundary reports, conservation documents, routine material. Then she found an envelope wedged between two binders. It had never been opened. The seal remained intact. Arthur's handwriting appeared across the front. For board review, if anything happens to me, everyone froze. Leonard carefully examined the envelope. No signs of tampering. Caleb stared at it. The timing felt impossible, as though Arthur had anticipated every step, every obstacle, every attempt to discredit him. Finally, Leonard opened it. Inside was a short memorandum, only 2 pages. Attached was a notarized statement. The document described Arthur's concerns regarding specific redevelopment parcels and listed several company names. Most were already familiar, one wasn't. Ridgeway Strategic Holdings. Nobody recognized it. Dana immediately searched her records. Nothing. No direct connection, no obvious link, just a name. Yet Arthur had underlined it twice, which meant it mattered. The mystery grew larger. Again, each answer seemed to uncover another hidden door. By midnight, Dana called from her hotel. Her voice sounded different. Urgent. I found Ridgeway. Everyone gathered around the speakerphone. Go ahead. It doesn't appear in the public transaction chains. Then where is it? A pause. Private financing. Caleb exchanged a glance with Leonard. Dana continued. It sits behind multiple investment vehicles. Owned by who? Another pause, longer this time. When she finally answered, nobody moved. Martin. The room fell silent, not indirectly, not through partners, not through subsidiaries. Martin himself. The discovery changed everything. For months, maybe years, Martin had insisted he maintained professional distance from several disputed acquisitions. Now Arthur's note had exposed a direct connection, a hidden one. Exactly the kind Arthur had warned about. For the first time, Leonard allowed himself a small smile. That's significant. It gets worse. Dana sounded grim. Ridgeway isn't just involved in historical transactions. Caleb felt tension rise immediately. What else? It's participating in the current New Hampshire sale. The words hit like a hammer. Arthur's land. The disputed property, the cabin, everything connected back to Martin again, and now there was evidence. Real evidence, not assumptions, not theories, documents, records, ownership structures. The chain was finally becoming visible. After the call ended, nobody spoke for several moments. Then Leonard quietly gathered the papers. We're taking this to the board. Caleb nodded. All of it, no. Leonard's expression hardened. Everything. For the first time since opening the vault, Caleb felt something other than grief. Resolve. Not confidence, not optimism. Resolve. Arthur had carried this burden alone. Caleb wouldn't. Just after 1 a.m, another message arrived from the same unknown number. No text, no explanation. Only a scanned document, a board briefing packet, prepared for the emergency hearing. Caleb opened the final page. His blood ran cold. The packet contained copies of project approvals, budget authorizations, acquisition signatures, his signatures, dozens of them. Across the top of the page, beneath Martin's handwritten notes, appeared a single sentence. If Martin falls, make sure Caleb falls first. The emergency hearing lasted nearly 6 hours. By the end, nobody in the room was arguing about Arthur Rourke anymore. The argument had shifted to records, money trails, ownership structures, and documented evidence. Martin arrived confident. He carried copies of Caleb's approvals, signed project authorizations, and acquisition documents. He repeated the same defense he had relied on for years. Arthur had been unstable. Arthur had misunderstood ordinary business practices. Caleb was trying to rewrite history because guilt had finally caught up with him. This time, the defense didn't hold. Caleb did something Martin never expected. He stopped denying his own failures. When the board questioned his signatures, Caleb admitted they were real. He admitted he had trusted Martin. He admitted he had ignored warning signs because success was easier to accept than discomfort. The room grew quiet. Martin had prepared for denial. He had not prepared for honesty. Then Leonard presented the evidence. The witnessed inventory from the hidden vault, the duplicate title files preserved by Walter Green, the survey overlays that matched Arthur's notes, the mail receipts showing repeated attempts to contact Caleb, the handwriting analysis identifying suspicious releases, the forensic accounting that connected shell companies to Martin's private entities, and finally, Arthur's notarized recorded statement. The recording played through the conference speakers. Arthur's voice sounded older than Caleb remembered. Tired, steady, certain. He described how Martin first approached him as a friend and business ally. Then came pressure. Then isolation. When Arthur discovered forged releases and hidden transfers, Martin began redirecting correspondence, filtering information, and encouraging others to dismiss Arthur as unreliable. Arthur explained why he hid the records. He no longer trusted the mail. He no longer trusted lawyers connected to Martin, and eventually he no longer trusted anyone close to Caleb's business world. The silence afterward felt heavier than any accusation. For years, Martin had controlled the narrative. The recording shattered it. The board voted before sunset. Martin was immediately removed from management authority over the redevelopment fund. His access to accounts, investor communications, and project files was revoked pending the independent audit. The disputed accounts were frozen. The title injunction remained in place. The planned demolition was halted indefinitely. For the first time, Martin looked genuinely afraid. 3 months later, the consequences continued to unfold. The audit confirmed undisclosed conflicts involving Ridgeway Strategic Holdings and multiple shell company transactions connected to disputed parcels. Several transfers were referred for further regulatory review. Martin lost board positions tied to the fund. Professional organizations suspended his memberships. Settlement negotiations forced his side entities to return profits linked to the disputed transactions. The process moved slowly, as legal processes often did, but the outcome was already clear. The empire he had protected through secrecy no longer belonged to him. The New Hampshire sale was voided through the title challenge. Arthur's land remained untouched. The conservation proposal found inside Arthur's final sealed case became the foundation for something new. A family-controlled conservation trust was established. Caleb served as steward, not owner, not developer. Steward. The distinction mattered. It was exactly what Arthur had wanted. Caleb's own company faced consequences as well. A housing repair and tenant assistance fund was created using company resources and restitution agreements. Independent compliance monitors were brought in. Caleb voluntarily stepped away from expansion decisions while the review continued. Some investors hated the decision, others respected it. For once, Caleb no longer measured success by applause. One rainy afternoon in Boston, he visited a building his company had nearly cleared for redevelopment. Several adult tenants gathered in a small community room. They knew who he was. Some were skeptical, some were angry. They had every right to be. Caleb did not ask for forgiveness. He did not explain himself. He listened. He apologized where apology was owed. Then he signed the revised redevelopment plan that preserved affordable units and protected current residents from displacement. When he left, nobody applauded. That was fine. The purpose had never been applause. Back in New Hampshire, the changes felt quieter. Ruth became the official caretaker of the restored cabin archive. Not because anyone pitied her, because Arthur had trusted her judgment when few others had. Nora completed a historical land record correction that formally changed Arthur's designation from non-cooperative property owner to documented whistleblower. The correction seemed small on paper. It wasn't. A man's reputation had finally been returned to him. Months after the hearing, Caleb stood once more inside the cabin. The fireplace remained exactly where it had always been. Beneath it, the steel room still existed, no longer hidden, no longer forgotten. The vault had been cleaned, catalogued, and preserved. Arthur's maps rested in archival sleeves. His notes were organized. His evidence was protected. Nothing needed to be buried anymore. As evening settled outside, Caleb sat alone at the old table and opened the final letter. He had already read it once. Tonight he read it aloud, not for an audience, not for a camera, not for history, for Arthur. The words hurt less than before, not because the loss had disappeared, because the truth finally occupied the space where doubt once lived. Arthur had not abandoned him. Arthur had not chosen silence. He had been fighting for years while almost everyone, including his own son, misunderstood what he was trying to protect. Caleb folded the letter carefully. Then he walked toward the small archive room. Mounted behind glass was the original demolition order he had brought to the property months earlier, the paper that had started everything. A red line crossed through it from corner to corner. Beside it hung a simple plaque, Arthur Rourke. Below the name was a single sentence: he was not wrong to protect what others wanted buried. Caleb stood there for a long time. The pain remained, the regret remained, but neither controlled him anymore. Outside, the forest moved softly in the evening wind. Inside, the cabin finally felt like a home again. If you had discovered that the person you doubted had been protecting you all along, would you have found the courage to admit it? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for sharing this journey.